Tonight, I want to tell you about 4 encounters that never became the kind of stories people argue about at dinner parties. They did not make headlines. They did not become documentaries. They were not chased by cameras or neatly explained by experts. Most strange events don't become stories at all. They become entries, a line typed into a log, a timestamp, a brief note in restrained language, a box checked, a form filed, and then, quietly, life continues. And that is why they are so unsettling. Because when something truly unusual happens, the first people to see it are often not thrill seekers, or believers, or men with microphones. They are night shift operators, dispatchers, harbor controllers, technicians sitting alone beneath fluorescent lights, people whose job is not to wonder, but to keep things running. They do not write, "We saw a craft from another world." They write, "Anomalous light observed. No hazard, no escalation required." They write, "Unidentified track. Duration, brief, no further action." And then they go on with their shift. Not because they don't care, not because they're part of a conspiracy, but because systems are built to handle what is practical. They have thresholds. They are trained to respond to danger, not mystery. If something appears, behaves strangely, and then leaves without causing harm, the machinery of daily life often has no place to put it. So it gets stored in the quiet corners of paperwork. Tonight's 4 stories live in those corners. They are not the dramatic kind. No screaming, no chase through the woods, no cinematic reveal at the last moment. Instead, they are slow. They are measured. They are the sort of accounts that sound almost boring until you notice what is being described. And in each one, the most important detail is not what happened. It is what did not happen. It did not trigger the usual alarms. It did not fit the categories that would force a larger response. It did not stay long, enough to be captured properly. It did not leave behind anything that demanded an explanation. It simply appeared, was noted, and then was allowed to vanish. If you're listening to this while trying to fall asleep, that's exactly the point. You don't need to tense up. You don't need to brace for impact. Just let the details arrive gently, like rain tapping on glass. We'll move through these accounts like an archivist paging through old files, slowly, carefully, without rushing. I'll tell you what the record shows, what was said, what was logged, and what was quietly ignored. And if you start to drift off, that's fine. These stories do not demand your full attention. They were never meant to. They were never designed for entertainment. They were designed to be forgotten. But for a little while tonight, we'll remember them. We'll start with a coastal radar station on a calm night, where an ordinary screen displayed an ordinary set of blips. And then one of those blips began behaving in a way the system could not comfortably name. No sirens followed, no public warning, no dramatic aftermath. Just a track, a timestamp, and a small note that tried, politely, to make the impossible sound routine. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and when you're ready, we'll open the first file. The station was not a secret one. It sat on a low rise above the water, a practical building with salt-stained windows, a humming equipment room, and an antenna array that had been painted so many times it carried its own history in layers. Its job was simple: watch the approaches, track what moved across the horizon, and keep the night from surprising anyone. Most nights, the screen was a comfort, a slow sweep, a faint bloom of noise where the weather lived. a few steady returns where ships moved along known lanes. Occasional aircraft tracks passing higher than the sea haze. Everything with a rhythm, everything with a reason. And if something appeared without a reason, the system had a way of correcting it. A ghost return, a burst of interference, a bird flock at the wrong angle. The operator would check the settings, adjust the gain, and the anomaly would vanish with the same quiet efficiency that produced it. This story begins on a night that should have belonged entirely to routine. The date recorded in the shift log is late autumn, early in the 2000s. The sea was calm enough to look almost flat from the windows. Wind was present, but not aggressive. The kind that shakes a sign, not a building. Visibility was decent for that coast. Thin fog offshore, clear above it, and a moon that came and went behind slow cloud. The night operator was alone at the console, as he often was. He had the sort of job that is mostly waiting and occasionally doing. A mug of tea beside the keyboard, a paper notebook open to the margin, a radio turned down low, not to fill the room, but to prove it was not empty. At Ardro 112, the radar sweep marked a new return, not dramatic, not bright. Just a clean point where there had been none on the previous cycle. It was not unusual to see new returns. A small fishing boat changing course, a coastal craft leaving harbor late, a helicopter crossing without calling in. The world is full of people doing ordinary things at odd hours, so the operator did what he always did. He watched it for another sweep, then another. The return held. It did not smear into weather. It did not fade like a weak reflection. It remained stable, almost polite, as if it understood it was being observed and was trying not to cause trouble. He tagged it, a simple label on the display, an internal mark so he could track it without confusing it with the other moving points. He noted the bearing, the approximate distance, the direction of travel, and then he waited for it to identify itself. Most things do, not with words exactly, but with behavior. A boat moves like a boat. An aircraft moves like an aircraft. A storm front moves like a storm front. Even mistakes have familiar signatures. This one did not. At 0118, it altered course, not in a sweeping arc, not in a gradual correction. It changed direction in a way that looked, on the screen, like a decision rather than a drift. The speed reading climbed briefly, then settled again. That, too, was not entirely impossible. Speed calculations can jump when the system recalculates between sweeps. A return can appear to move faster if the signal is playing tricks. So the operator did the next sensible thing. He checked the gain. He adjusted the clutter suppression. He compared it against a secondary display that showed raw returns without filtering. The point remained. In fact, on the raw display, it was clearer, not brighter, just cleaner, like it belonged there. At Aura 123, he tried the simplest confirmation available. He called out on the marine frequency, using the routine phrasing that invites correction without accusing anyone of wrongdoing. This is Coastal Watch, unidentified contact at, he gave the bearing. Please advise your identity and intentions. He expected one of three outcomes. A small boat would answer, annoyed but cooperative. An aircraft would ignore it, or there would be no response, and the contact would resolve itself as an error. Instead, there was silence, not the silence of an empty channel. The channel carried its normal hiss, distant replies, faint chatter from places too far to matter. But no one addressed the call. At Aura 129, the contact did something subtle and worse than obvious. It slowed, then it stopped. On a radar screen, stopping is not a dramatic freeze frame. It is a return that remains in the same position across multiple sweeps, refusing to behave like a moving object and refusing to behave like land. He watched it hold position over open water. It did not drift with current. It did not wander as the wind pushed. It did not smear as wave clutter rose and fell beneath it. It simply remained. And because the operator was trained to be cautious before being alarmed, he did not panic. He documented a timestamp, a note, contact holding position, another note, no response to hails. Then a practical action. He informed the supervisor on duty, not with excitement, but with the careful tone that says, "This is probably nothing, but I want it on record." The supervisor arrived a few minutes later, coat still on, moving with the mild irritation of someone pulled from paperwork. He looked at the screen. He asked the standard questions. "Any known traffic in that sector?" "No." "Any weather anomalies?" "Not in that shape." "Any equipment issues?" "Secondary confirms." He stood quietly, watching. At Lero 141, the return resumed motion. Again, not gradually. It moved as if it had been waiting for something to finish. Its direction was not toward the station, which would have forced escalation. It moved laterally, almost parallel to the coastline, as though following an invisible line offshore. And then it began changing speed with an odd rhythm, not random, not erratic, a pattern, faster for 2 sweeps, slower for 3, then steady again. The supervisor asked for a cross-check. Another system, another pair of eyes. So the operator called, a nearby facility whose equipment overlapped coverage. The conversation was short, professional, and entirely unromantic. "Do you have any contact at this bearing and range?" A pause, then, "Stand by." When the reply came, it was cautious. "We have a return, yes. Weak, but consistent." That should have been comforting. Confirmation often is, but confirmation also removes one of the best escapes, the idea that you imagined it. They asked if any transponder data was present. There was none. They asked if it matched any filed flight plan. It did not. They asked if it could be a vessel. Possibly, the supervisor said, though his voice did not fully believe it. And then they did something that turned the whole incident into a problem with no correct solution. They did nothing else. Because there was no immediate hazard. The contact was offshore. It was not approaching shipping lanes aggressively. It was not headed for land. It was not interfering with communications. It was not behaving in a way that fit any established emergency protocol. In the language of systems, it was anomalous, but it was not actionable. That is the quiet trap at the heart of these stories. If something is strange but not dangerous, the system does not know how to lift it into the next level of response. It does not know what to call it. And if you do not know what to call a thing, you cannot justify the machinery that follows. So the operator continued to document. At 02:06, the return briefly split, not into 2 clear objects, but into a primary point and a faint echo that moved alongside it. This lasted only a few sweeps before the second return vanished again. It did not look like a reflection. It did not look like a second vessel. It looked, on the screen, like the contact had acquired a shadow. They wrote it down anyway, in the plainest possible way. Possible secondary return observed. Duration, brief. At 02:19, the contact made its sharpest movement of the aj-i-machant night. The track shifted in a single sweep from one location to another, Not a smooth curve, not a long streak, a repositioning, like a chess piece moved by an unseen hand. The operator checked for signal dropouts. He checked for sweep errors. Nothing. The nearby facility confirmed a similar discontinuity. And again, there was still no siren to pull. No phrase in the manual that said, if the contact moves in a way that makes no physical sense, proceed to page 32. The manual is written for boats, storms, and aircraft. It is written for the world as it is supposed to be. So they watched. And the strangest part of the night was not the movement itself. It was the calmness of the response. Not because the men were cold, not because they were brave, but because they were trained to keep their feelings out of the signal. They did not say, "This is impossible." They said, "Confirm last sweep." They did not say, "What is it?" They said, "Any response to hails?" They did not say, "Call someone important." They said, "Continue to monitor." At 0237, the contact began to fade, not like a boat turning away, not like an aircraft climbing. It faded the way a thought fades when you stop concentrating on it. One moment it was clean and stable. The next it was weaker, then weaker still, as if it were stepping out of the radar's reach without moving away. They watched it dim across 3 sweeps. At 0244, it vanished entirely. They held their breath without meaning to. Then they watched the empty water on the screen and waited for it to return. It did not. It did not leave debris. It did not produce a distress call. It did not trigger any later report of missing vessels. It did not create an official incident beyond the log entry itself. By morning, the sea lanes were busy again. The shift changed. The console was wiped down. The notes were filed. The supervisor wrote a summary in the correct language. Unidentified radar contact observed, offshore, no transponder, no radio response, secondary confirmation obtained, no hazard, contact faded, no further action. That sentence is the reason these things vanish. It contains everything that happened, and it makes it sound like nothing at all. Weeks later, the operator mentioned it to someone who hadn't been there. He did not say alien. He did not say craft. He described it as a track that behaved oddly. The person listened politely and offered the simplest comfort available. Equipment does funny things. And perhaps that is true sometimes. But the logbook remained, a timestamp, a bearing, a note written by a man trained not to dramatize. And if you read it now, in the quiet tone it was written, you can feel the shape of what happened without ever seeing it. Not because the log proves anything, but because it shows you a moment when a system looked out at the world, saw something it could not name, and chose the only safe option it had. It wrote it down. Then it let the night continue. There is a particular kind of darkness you only find on rural highways. Not the theatrical darkness of horror films, where the night feels staged and purposeful. This is a practical darkness. Long stretches of road without streetlights, fields that dissolve into shadow, and tree lines that look like solid walls when you approach them at speed. On nights like that, a driver's world becomes very small. Headlights, painted lines, occasional reflectors blinking back like patient eyes. And beyond the beam, nothing that requires attention, which is why most reports that come in from those roads are predictable. A deer, a stalled vehicle, a drunk driver drifting between lanes, a broken sign, a fire in a ditch. Dispatchers are trained for these things. They speak in calm codes. They ask precise questions. They do not encourage drama. and they do not indulge it. Their job is to turn chaos into procedure. This case began as one of the simplest calls a dispatcher can receive. A single driver calling from a payphone just after midnight, saying there was a light behind him on Route 19. That by itself was nothing. Rural drivers see lights all the time: a vehicle following too closely, a motorcycle, a farm truck, a distant tower beacon reflecting in fog, a helicopter passing overhead. So the dispatcher did what dispatchers do. She asked the basic questions. Where are you? Which direction are you traveling? How long have you noticed it? Is it a hazard? The caller gave a location by the mile marker and the nearest crossroads. He sounded tired rather than terrified. He said the light had been behind him for 10 minutes, maybe longer. He said it wasn't a car exactly, though he couldn't explain why. It's just there, he said. The dispatcher asked if it was keeping pace. Yes, he said, but it's wrong. It's too steady, and it's not shaking like headlights do. Headlights bounce slightly on rural roads. Even the best suspension can't smooth out every dip. A light that stays perfectly level, perfectly calm, often belongs to something higher than the road. So she asked the next sensible question. Could it be a helicopter? No, he said. It's too low, and it's not making any sound. Sound can fail to travel properly at night. Wind can carry it away. A person inside a moving car can miss it. There were still many ordinary explanations available. So she logged the call as a general concern and told him to continue to the next well-lit area, a gas station, a diner, a place with other cars. That should have ended it. Most calls like this fade on their own. The driver reaches town. The strange light turns out to be a farm truck. The night returns to its normal shape. But at 00:41, the dispatcher received a second call. Different caller, same route. This one came from a man driving a delivery van. He reported a bright light to his left, off the road, moving through the tree line. He did not describe it as chasing him. He described it as pacing him, like it knew where he was going and had decided to travel alongside, just out of view. The dispatcher compared the locations. The two callers were separated by several miles. The times overlapped in a way that suggested the same phenomenon. If it was the same, would have had to move quickly between them, or appear more than once. She asked the delivery driver what the light looked like. A ball, he said. Not big. Bright enough that I can see it through the trees. Like it's searching, but not for me. Like it's just traveling. Again, she asked about sound. Nothing, he said. That's what's wrong. She logged the second call. She noted the phrase he used, ball of light, because dispatch logs tend to preserve the exact words that don't fit neatly into categories. And she did not escalate. Not yet. Because nothing had happened. No crash. No injury. No obstruction. No visible fire. No threat. Only two drivers reporting something unusual. In the quiet logic of a night shift system, that is not enough. At 00:53, the first driver called again. This time, his voice had changed. Not frantic, not screaming, but tighter, like a man speaking carefully, because he does not trust himself to speak freely. It's ahead of me now, he said. The dispatcher paused. Ahead of you? Yes, he said. I haven't passed anyone. No one's turned off. There's no way it got ahead of me. But it's there, at the junction. It's waiting. She asked him to describe what he meant by waiting. It's just hovering by the sign, he said. Not on the road, just beside it, like it knows I have to take this turn. The dispatcher asked him the only question that mattered for procedure. Are you able to continue safely? There was a hesitation. I can, he said, but I don't want to. She told him to keep driving, to stay on the main road, to go toward the town, lights. She asked him to keep his doors locked. Standard advice. Advice that works for human threats and sometimes makes a person feel better, even when the threat is something else. As he drove, she stayed on the line with him. And then the detail arrived. The detail that gave this case its strange shape. He described the light moving from junction to junction ahead of him, not racing him, not circling, not trailing behind. It appeared, he said, at places where the road branched, places where a driver makes decisions. First at a four-way crossing, then near a bridge sign, then by the entrance to a narrow stretch between fields. Each time he would approach, and the light would move away, not into the distance, but laterally, sliding off to the side, then reappearing farther ahead. The dispatcher asked if he was sure he wasn't confusing it with a distant tower light. No, he said, this is close, close enough that it makes the sign glow. That mattered. Reflective. Signs respond to light in a specific way. They flare back. They bloom. A light bright enough to illuminate a sign at close range would also illuminate the road. But the driver kept repeating that the road itself remained dark, which is another way of saying the light didn't behave like light is supposed to. At Oro 107, the dispatcher made a decision, not a dramatic one, a procedural one. She asked the county patrol unit closest to Route 19 to check the area. The patrol car acknowledged. The deputy sounded mildly annoyed, as if he expected to find teenagers with flashlights or a drunk driver with a broken headlamp. He began moving toward the route, and then, at Oro 114, a third call came in. This one was shorter. A woman, voice small, saying she was parked at the roadside because she had seen a bright light cross the road ahead of her. Not like a car, not like a plane. Cross the road, sideways, at low height, slow enough that she could see it pass behind the branches. She said it was silent. She said she had felt, briefly, like the inside of her car was brighter, as if something had looked in without touching. The dispatcher asked if she was safe. The woman said she thought so. She said she was waiting for another car to pass before she continued, because she didn't want to be alone on the road. The dispatcher told her to stay put and to turn on her hazard lights. She noted the location. She looked at the map, and that's when the pattern began to form. All three calls clustered around a certain segment of Route 19. A long stretch with very few houses, a bridge, and two major junctions. A segment that forced you to choose directions. At 0120, the patrol unit reported arriving near the first junction. He saw nothing at first. Then he saw something. He described it not as a craft, not as a vehicle, but as a bright light off the roadway near the sign, exactly where the first driver had said it would be. The dispatcher asked if he could approach. I can, he said, but it's moving. How? Not fast, he said, just away, like it's keeping distance. He attempted to reposition his car. He turned down a side road to come at it from another angle. And when he did, he reported something that made the entire event feel less like a chase and more like an answer to a question. It's at the next junction, he said. The dispatcher asked him to repeat that. I'm telling you, he said, voice lower now. It's not following me. It's not running. It's just there, where I'm going. For the first time, the dispatcher's notes shifted slightly in tone. Still professional, still restrained, but more detailed. She logged timestamps with care. She wrote exact phrases. Because what was occurring did not fit the ordinary categories. And when a thing does not fit categories, documentation becomes instinct. The patrol unit attempted a full stop, lights off, engine idling, simply watching. The light remained at the junction, hovering low, bright enough to halo the signpost, but not bright enough to cast useful beams on the pavement. It did not flicker like a lantern. It did not strobe like an aircraft beacon. It did not sweep like a spotlight. It did not behave like headlights. And importantly, it did not provoke. It did not rush the patrol car. It did not approach the driver. It did not strike the road. It did not emit sound. It simply held position for a time, long enough for a man trained to deal with human threats to grow uneasy with a threat that was not acting human at all. At Aura 131, the light moved, not away down the road, off the road, into the field. The patrol unit watched it drift low across a stretch of grass, maintaining a steady height, then pause again, as if it had reached another point on the map that mattered to it. The deputy attempted to follow on foot for several steps. He stopped himself quickly. He later described the reason in the most honest language a report can contain. It felt wrong, he said. Not fear, exactly, not panic. A sense that he had stepped close to something that did not care about his authority, did not recognize his badge, and did not exist within the rules he normally relied on. The dispatcher asked if he required backup. There was a pause. No, he said. No, it's not doing anything. It's just moving. And because it was not doing anything, in the strict sense, the escalation threshold remained unmet. That is the quiet cruelty of it. If the light had caused a crash, the system would have responded. If it had blocked the road, the system would have responded. If it had injured someone, the system would have responded. But it did none of those things. So the system hovered in the uncomfortable middle, watching, recording, waiting for justification. At 0143, the first driver, the one who had begun this, reached the outskirts of a small town. He said he could see streetlights now. He said the light that had been appearing ahead of him was no longer visible. He sounded relieved in a careful way, as if relief might invite it back. The woman who had parked said that another car eventually passed her, and she followed it until she reached town. She said she did not see the light again. The patrol unit remained on Route 19 for another 20 minutes. He saw nothing further. The fields remained dark. The junction sign stood plain and empty, reflecting only the ordinary glow of his headlights. At 0212, the dispatcher closed the incident, not with a conclusion, with a phrase. Unfounded, no hazard. That's what these cases become. A cluster of calls, a patrol check, a note, a quiet end. In the following days, there was no news story, no community meeting, no investigators arriving from outside. The people involved told a few close friends, and those friends offered the usual comforts. It was probably a helicopter. It was probably a tower light. It was probably teenagers. But the dispatcher kept her notes, and the deputy kept his report, and somewhere in a filing cabinet, the calls were preserved in the flat language of systems. A light that appeared where drivers would have to choose. A light that moved ahead without passing. A light that followed the route rather than the vehicle. And the most unsettling detail of all was not its brightness or its silence. It was its patience, as if it had all night to wait at the next junction, calm and steady, until the next set of headlights arrived, until the next person entered that long rural darkness and discovered quietly that the road was not as empty as it looked. Small observatories rarely feel dramatic. They are not the domes you see in glossy photographs, perched on remote mountaintops, staffed by teams in matching jackets. More often, they are modest structures attached to universities or local science programs, functional buildings with scuffed floors, a stubborn coffee machine, and equipment that must be treated gently because the budget is always one repair away from disaster. They exist for patience. They measure, they record, they compare. They do not chase mysteries. They do not hunt the sky. They do what the sky allows them to do, which is mostly to repeat itself. That is why this case is strange. Not because it involved a spectacular sighting, not because it ended in panic, but because it appeared, moved through the sky with quiet precision, and left behind just enough evidence to be difficult and not enough to be useful. The incident took place in the late 1990s during a routine overnight imaging session at a small university observatory. The building sat on the edge of town where the streetlights thinned, high enough that the horizon was visible in most directions. It was not a perfect sight. Light pollution softened the stars. Moisture rolled in some nights. Planes crossed the sky at predictable intervals. But it was good enough for student work. That night's session was not special. It was part of a long-term sky survey, repeated exposures of the same regions over weeks and months, looking for changes so small they could be missed by an inattentive eye. The kind of project that lives on quiet persistence. The technician on duty, an upper-year student, arrived shortly before midnight, performed the standard checks, and began the automated sequence. He logged the weather, clear enough. He logged the equipment status, stable. He logged the target region, a star field that would be unremarkable to anyone without a reason to stare at it for hours. Then he did what you do in places like that. He waited. The observatory, once the dome is closed and the telescope begins tracking, is mostly soundless. You hear the faint motor hum of the mount adjusting. You hear the soft click of the shutter. You hear your own breathing when you stop moving. If you are alone, that quiet can become heavy. So he did what many night technicians do. He kept a radio low. He scribbled notes. He watched the monitor where each exposure appeared, frame after frame, like a slow, patient heartbeat. At 01:38, the software flagged an unusual transit. That wording matters. It did not alert, UFO detected, or anything theatrical. It simply noted that a bright object had crossed the field in a way that matched one of its automated categories, something moving against the star background. This happens constantly in astronomy: satellites, aircraft, meteors, occasional camera artifacts. Most of them are easy to identify. They leave signatures. Satellites make clean lines, often at consistent speed, sometimes with a gentle change in brightness as they rotate. Aircraft blink. Meteors flare and burn and fade, usually leaving a slight tail, sometimes fragmenting. So the technician did not feel fear. He felt annoyance. A transit can ruin data. It means you might have to discard frames. It means you might have to rerun exposures later. He brought up the flagged image and looked at it closely. The object had crossed the frame as a thin line, but it was not a perfect streak. It appeared segmented, not like blinking lights, but like the shutter had captured it in distinct positions, almost as if the object had stepped through the exposure rather than flowing. That too can happen with certain imaging settings. Depending on the camera and exposure time, a moving object can appear like beads on a string, so he checked the metadata. Exposure, standard. Tracking, stable. No shutter glitches, no mount errors. He opened the previous frame. No line. He opened the next frame. Another. Line. Similar orientation, similar brightness, but displaced, as though the object had moved a significant distance in a very short interval. Again, this could have been a satellite on a low orbit moving quickly. It could have been a near-Earth object briefly passing the field. But then he noticed the angle. Satellites tend to follow predictable paths relative to an observer and the sky's rotation. Their tracks look like they belong to the geometry of Earth and orbit. This did not. It cut across the star field at an angle that felt, to an experienced eye, subtly incorrect, like handwriting that is nearly neat, but not quite human. He did what technicians do when intuition begins whispering louder than comfort. He checked the satellite prediction list. It did not match anything scheduled. This was not definitive. Predictions can be incomplete. Not every object is cataloged, especially in earlier decades. But it was the first small door closing. He checked the aircraft logs. Local. Flights were minimal at that hour, and aircraft do not appear as clean, silent lines. They blink, and their blinking reveals them. This line did not blink. He checked the brightness profile across the track. It was steady. Not the steady of a distant star. This was a moving object, but steady in a way that suggested controlled output, not reflected sunlight. Still, he did not write impossible. He wrote in his own notes a phrase that indicates uncertainty without drama. Unidentified transit, not matching known satellite list. At 0146, the object returned, not in the same field. In the next scheduled field, the telescope moved to, after completing its sequence. The survey was stepping through adjacent patches of sky, like turning pages. When the telescope shifted, the technician expected a new set of frames with different stars, different patterns. Instead, on the first exposure in the new field, another transit appeared. Same type of line, same steady brightness, same angle. That was the second door closing. Because a random satellite may cross a field, yes. But to cross two adjacent fields in back-to-back exposures at the same orientation, with the same brightness profile, suggests either an object with perfect timing, or a system being observed by something that understood its pattern. That is a dramatic way to say it, and technicians do not speak dramatically. So he did not. He simply stopped the automation. He took manual control and returned the telescope to the first field. He ran a shorter exposure, hoping to catch it again. Nothing. He tried a longer exposure. Nothing. Then, as if the sky had waited for him to stop searching, the transit appeared again, this time at the edge of the frame, barely clipping the corner, as though it had passed nearby but not intended to be fully recorded. He watched the monitor with a tight feeling in his chest. He looked through the dome slit, expecting, irrationally, to see something with his eyes. He saw only stars, no glow, no moving light, no aircraft blink. The object existed only in the instrument. That happens sometimes too. Cameras catch what eyes cannot. But the technician knew the difference between a faint satellite and something else. So he performed the next check, the one you do when you don't trust the sky or your own mind. He ran calibration frames, dark frames, bias frames, flat fields. He looked for sensor defects, electronic noise, any pattern that might mimic a moving line. Nothing explained it. At 02:03, he woke his supervisor, not with excitement, not with fear. He called and said calmly that he had a recurring unidentified transit affecting multiple fields and wanted a second pair of eyes. Supervisors who've heard every kind of false alarm learn to keep their voice neutral. The professor arrived wearing a coat over sleep clothes, hair flattened, expression composed. He looked at the frames without comment. He asked the same questions the technician had already asked himself. Exposure settings? Stable. Tracking error? None. Known satellites? Checked. Aircraft? No blinking. Could it be a meteor? It repeats, the technician said. That one fact shifted the professor's posture slightly. Meteors do not repeat. If you see one, you see it once. They sat together and watched the next scheduled exposure. Nothing. Another exposure. Nothing. The professor suggested something practical. Perhaps it had passed, and the technician had simply been unlucky enough to catch it twice. They restarted the automation to complete the survey. At 02:19, it appeared again. A line across the frame, clean and steady, at the same incorrect angle, as if the sky had politely waited for an audience. The professor did not say UFO. He did not say alien. He said something more useful and more unsettling. That's not behaving like an orbiting object. He asked for a time series. They pulled the timestamps and calculated approximate angular speed based on displacement across frames. The result was uncomfortable, not because it was impossible in the grand sense, but because it fell into the category that scientists dislike, not quite matching anything known and not precise enough to claim anything unknown. It was, in the most dangerous way, ambiguous. They checked for a ground-based source, a rotating beacon, a distant tower light, something reflecting into the telescope optics. But ground-based sources usually create flares, ghost reflections, irregularities tied to the telescope's orientation. This track remained consistent across different pointings. It moved through the sky as if it belonged there. The professor told the technician to keep all frames and write a clean incident note. Not a story, a record. And this is where cases like this often die. Because once you write the record, you face the next question. What do you do with it? Yubatsin can submit it for analysis, yes, but analysis requires time, and time requires funding, and funding requires a clear reason, and a clear reason requires usually that something happened that forced attention. This did not force attention. No one was hurt. No equipment was damaged. No aircraft reported danger. No public saw anything. The observatory did its job, recorded something odd, and then the sky returned to normal as if nothing had occurred. By 03:10, the transit stopped. They did not fade gradually. They simply ceased appearing, as though the object had moved on, or shut off, or stepped out of the survey's reach. The remainder of the night was quiet. The professor returned home. The technician finished the session, saved the data, and wrote his notes in the plainest language he could manage. Recurring unidentified transit, multiple fields, no known match, no visual confirmation. In the weeks that followed, the frames were reviewed again and again by different eyes. Some suggested it was an untracked satellite. Some suggested an imaging artifact that happened to align. Some suggested an unusual meteor sequence, though it did not behave like one. No conclusion survived scrutiny because each explanation fit only part of the evidence, which meant the evidence fit nothing well enough to earn a name. So it became what most strange things become in professional environments. It became a folder, a labeled set of files stored on a drive that was later replaced. It became a note in a paper notebook. It became a memory that grew softer each time it was recalled, until it began to sound like exaggeration, even to the people who had seen the frames. And yet, the frames existed. They showed a clean transit, steady brightness, incorrect angle, repeated appearances across adjacent fields, a thing that crossed the sky without blinking, without flaring, without ever showing itself to the naked eye. A silent transit that seemed almost careful, almost considerate, like something passing through a place it did not wish to disturb. The technician graduated. The professor moved on to more fundable work. The observatory continued taking images of ordinary stars, ordinary nights, ordinary changes. And that may be the most unsettling part, because the sky did not change. The world did not acknowledge the event. Only the instrument did. Only the record did. And if you open that folder now, years later, and look at the thin lines drawn across the star field, you can feel what the technician felt in that quiet dome at 2 a.m. Not terror, not certainty, just the strange, persistent thought that something passed overhead, saw the system watching, and left behind a trace that was almost, but not quite, enough to be believed. Harbors have their own night voice. Even when the docks look still, there is always motion, water shifting against pilings, chains clicking softly, distant engines idling somewhere out of sight. The air carries salt, fuel, wet rope, and the faint metallic smell that lingers around working equipment. And beneath all of that, there is the harbor's other world, the part no one sees directly. The bottom. That is why sonar exists. Not for mystery, for safety, for navigation, for keeping ships from meeting what they cannot see. This case happened during a routine night shift in a working harbor. One of those places busy enough to justify constant monitoring, but small enough that every operator knows what normal looks like. The system was not military. It was practical, used to identify submerged debris, shifting sandbars, anything that might become a hazard by morning. Most returns are ordinary: a slope, a discarded anchor, a broken beam, a patch of rock that makes the sonar brighten in a familiar way. They appear, get marked, and are either removed or avoided. That is the entire logic of the work. On the night in question, the water above the harbor was calm. Not glass smooth, but calm enough that the surface did not argue with the lights. A thin haze hovered low, and the moon made the darker stretches of water look heavy. Shortly after Doro 1 Hal, the operator ran a standard sweep. He expected nothing. Instead, the display showed a return that did not belong. It appeared as a consistent shape beneath open water, an area that was normally clean on the map, an area the harbor knew well. At first, he assumed it was a glitch or a temporary reflection caused by a passing wake. So he ran the sweep again. The return held. He adjusted sensitivity. He changed the angle. He ran a narrower scan to reduce noise. The return remained, crisp enough to register as a solid object, not just a random blot. It had contour, It had edge definition. It had the kind of clarity that makes an operator stop thinking in maybe and start thinking in what is down there. But when he looked up from the screen and out through the window, the surface above that location was empty. No boat, no buoy, no broken dock piece floating, no foam line, no disturbance that suggested a submerged vessel or large debris. Just dark water, quietly moving. This is the first detail worth noting, the contradiction between what the instrument insisted on and what the eye could confirm. In most cases, the eye wins. Sonar can be fooled. Eyes are simple. But the operator did not treat the instrument like it was lying. He treated it like it was reporting something that required verification. He logged the first observation, timestamp, approximate coordinates, strength of return. Then he called a second operator over, not because he was frightened, because this is what professionals do when a system presents something unusual. They ask another human to confirm they are seeing the same thing. The second operator looked, frowned, and said the words that always sound harmless until you're in the moment. "That's odd." Together, they ran a third sweep. The return was still there. It did not drift with the current. It did not smear like loose debris. It did not break apart like wave interference. It held its position with a steadiness that made it feel, in a quiet way, intentional. They checked the harbor traffic list. No vessel had reported sinking. No ship was registered in that spot. No construction had been done there recently. No underwater repair work scheduled. They checked the depth map. The area should have been a known depth, a known slope, consistent readings. But the return sat there like a shape placed on top of that known slope, a foreign object in a familiar space. At 01:22, the operator made the next practical move. He called the night harbor patrol, not the kind of patrol that carries drama, just a small craft that checks, docks, responds to minor emergencies, and keeps an eye on things that might become serious by morning. When the patrol boat arrived near the coordinates, its small navigation lights cut through the haze. The operators watched from the monitoring room as the boat slowed, idle humming. The patrol reported that the surface looked normal. No wreckage, no floating debris, no smell of fuel, no disturbance. The operator asked them to run a light over the surface anyway. They did. The beam moved across the water, revealing only ripples and darkness. Below, the sonar return remained bright and clean. This is where the case becomes strange in the way that doesn't invite excitement, only a slow discomfort. The patrol asked the obvious question: "Do you want us to drop a line?" Dropping a weighted line would have been a simple test. If something solid was below, the line would hit it. If not, it would fall to the expected depth. The operators hesitated, not because it was dangerous, because it was unnecessary. And that word, unnecessary, is how anomalies survive. If something does not force action, it stays in the category of, we'll watch it a bit longer. So they watched. At 01:38, the return changed. Not drastically, not like a creature moving or an object rising. It changed in contour, as if it had rotated slightly or shifted angle. The outline became narrower, then broader again. The operators ran another sweep to confirm. The return reformed with a different shape, still steady, still in the same general area, but altered enough to suggest the object was not simply lying there like a wreck. It was doing something. And yet above, the surface stayed calm. The patrol boat drifted in small circles, maintaining position. The crew reported nothing. No sound, no vibration, no bubbles rising, no unusual smell. At Aura 147, the sonar return began to move, slowly, not with the wandering drift of debris, but with a controlled glide. The operators watched it slide, along the bottom, still beneath open water, tracking a path that cut across the harbor map at an angle that did not follow channels or currents. The operator's notes became more detailed, without becoming more dramatic. Object moving, speed low, track steady, he notified the supervisor. The supervisor arrived, looked at the display, and did not react in the way people imagine supervisors react. He did not shout. He did not declare anything. He asked questions. Could it be a school of fish? No, the return was too solid. Could it be the patrol boat's wake interfering? No, the return was beneath, consistent across angles. Could it be equipment error? Secondary checks show consistent reading. The supervisor watched quietly. At 0203, the object stopped, held position. Then, over the span of 3 sweeps, it faded. Not as if it had moved away, because the fade happened without lateral displacement. It faded like a signal losing lock, like something stepping out of the sonar's ability to define it. One moment, it was there, clear contour, confident presence. The next, it weakened. Then it was gone. The operator ran another sweep immediately. Nothing. The patrol boat reported the same surface calmness, no disturbance, no sign that anything large had moved beneath them, no trace of debris, oil, or gas. And with that, the system found itself in the familiar uncomfortable space. An anomaly was observed, confirmed, tracked, and then removed itself. No incident occurred, no damage resulted, no rule had been broken, because no one could say what rule applied. The operator filed the report in the plainest language possible. Unidentified subsurface return observed, confirmed on multiple sweeps, brief movement recorded, return faded, no surface evidence, no hazard reported, no further action. By morning, harbor activity resumed. Tugboats moved, freight shifted, men shouted across the docks. The water was disturbed by ordinary work. And the return never appeared again. Not that week, not that month. The patrol crew told the story a few times over coffee, but it always ended in a shrug because there was no conclusion to offer. The operators moved on to other nights, other routine sweeps. The report was filed like so many strange things are filed, not as mystery, but as no hazard. And that is why it never went mainstream, because nothing happened that demanded public explanation. Only a brief moment when an instrument designed to map the harbor bottom drew the outline of something that should not have been there, something that moved with patience beneath empty water, before fading away like a thought the ocean chose not to share. And that is where we'll leave it tonight.